Who could survive 12 impossible labors, monsters, gods, and traps? Yet one man's destiny was carved through pain and glory. Hercules rose between legend and the impossible. Tonight, let this mythic journey carry you away, and welcome to Twilight Tales. Chapter 1. The Son of Zeus. Part 1. The Birth of Heracles and Hera's Jealousy. In the motionless silence of the heavens, where the winds slumber before awakening, Zeus, king of Olympus, gazed upon the land of mortals. The gods constantly observed the fate of men, and sometimes the pride or desire of the Olympians intertwined with that of humans. It was in this distant time that one of the most terrible and glorious stories of ancient Greece was born. The birth of Heracles, son of Zeus, destined to bear on his shoulders the weight of divine hatred and eternal glory. Alcmene, daughter of Electryon, king of Mycenae, was of noble beauty, rare virtue, and descended from Perseus, the ancient hero who had severed Medusa's head. Married to Amphitryon, a valiant general, she lived in Thebes in a tranquil household, unaware that her destiny was about to be bulliversed by the master of the gods. For Zeus, the all-powerful, fell in love with Alcmene. He coveted her purity, as he had coveted so many other mortal women, but with her he conceived a particular design, to father a son who would surpass all men, a demigod hero whose glory would endure through the centuries. To achieve his ends, Zeus took on the appearance of Amphitryon himself. One night he approached Alcmena's bed, cloaked in gentleness and deception. But to ensure this divine union was not brief, he stretched time. A single night lasted 3 days and 3 nights, suspended beneath the stars, so that from this embrace a child of unmatched strength would be born. When dawn finally chased away the shadows, Alcmene, unaware of the deception, believed she had spent the night with her husband, but in the secrecy of the heavens, Hera, Zeus's lawful wife, kept watch. The goddess's jealousy was relentless, her wrath more feared than sea storms. She had already punished her husband's lovers and their children. She would not tolerate a new bastard one day rivaling the gods themselves. Soon after, Amphitryon truly returned to Thebes, victorious from a campaign. He united with his wife, unaware that the conjugal bed had already been visited by the king of Olympus. Thus, Alcmene bore 2 children in her womb, one, the mortal fruit of Amphitryon, named Iphicles, the other, the divine fruit of Zeus, who would be called Heracles, the glory of Hera, an ironic name meant to appease the goddess by an homage she would nonetheless ceaselessly reject. When the time of childbirth came, Hera's anger descended like a dark cloud. She could not entirely prevent the birth, but she could delay it and divert its course. For at the same moment, another woman, Nisipe, a descendant of Perseus, was pregnant with an heir destined to rule. Hera manipulated the fates themselves. She hastened the birth of this child, Eurystheus, so that he would become king before Heracles, and that by divine decree Zeus's son would be subject to him. Thus, from the dawn of his existence, Heracles' destiny was marked by servitude and trial. The night of his birth was pierced by mysterious signs. Lightning split the sky without a storm, torches burned higher than usual, and the neighborhood dogs howled long toward the moon. Alcmene, in the pains of childbirth, prayed to Hera for aid, but the goddess turned a deaf ear. It was Eileithyia, goddess of childbirth, who, initially held back by Hera's jealousy, hesitated to come. It is said that Galinthias, Alcmene's faithful servant, tricked Eileithyia by ruse, proclaiming that the child was already born. Surprised, the goddess released her spell, and thus Heracles could finally come into the world, his first cries resounding like a new thunder. As soon as he was swaddled, omens multiplied. The infant already clenched his fists with the strength of an adult warrior. Amphitryon, amazed, did not yet grasp the magnitude of the destiny tied to his son. But Hera was quick to show her hatred. When Heracles was but a babe, the goddess sent 2 monstrous serpents to slither into the dark chamber where the twins slept side by side. Their scales gleamed like flames, their tongues hissed, and their fangs were ready to tear the tender flesh of the children. The stifling night seemed to hold its breath, but little Heracles, fearless, opened his eyes. His chubby arms reached out, and with an instinctive gesture, he seized each serpent by the throat. While little Iphicles screamed in terror, his brother strangled the monsters with his infant hands. When Amphitryon rushed in, he found the lifeless bodies of the serpents and the child calmly sitting, still holding his prey. This was the first exploit of Zeus's son, a blazing sign that his existence would not be that of an ordinary mortal. The fame of this episode spread quickly, inspiring both admiration and fear. Priests and augurs predicted that Heracles' destiny would be immense, but that it would also bear the marks of suffering and conflict with the gods. Alcmene, trembling, understood that her son would forever face trials sent by Hera. Yet, in her arms, she saw only a child who breathed softly after the struggle, as if victory had cost him less than a breath. Hera, humiliated by the failure of her serpents, swore that she would not let this child know peace. The very name Heracles, given later to appease her, rang like a challenge. The glory of Hera, though that glory was born of her hatred. Thus began the life of a hero, caught between the love of a divine father who could not always protect him and the eternal rage of a goddess who saw in him the most painful insult to her marriage. And beneath the skies of Greece, the gods fell silent for a moment, as if to contemplate the new flame that had just been kindled. The world had received a child destined for trials, tears, glory, and immortality. Heracles, son of Zeus and Alcmene, was born, and already the shadow of greatness rested upon his cradle. Part 2. The Prodigy Child, Early Exploits, and Supernatural Strength. Time passed, and the child who had strangled serpents in his cradle grew up in the house of Amphitryon and Alcmene. As the seasons followed one another, it became evident to all that this boy was unlike others. His size, vigor, and even appetite seemed boundless. Every gesture betrayed a strength no mortal his age could possess. Yet in his eyes still shone the innocence of a child, curious about the world, eager to discover the light of days. Heracles, for that was now the name whispered by augurs and priests when speaking of him, learned to walk like other children. But very early he astonished his parents. Barely a few months old, he lifted heavy objects with ease that even grown men would have struggled to carry. A full amphora, a wooden beam, a massive stone. These became unwitting toys in his small hands. Alcmene, sometimes frightened by her own offspring, prayed to Zeus in silence, asking that the child's strength not condemn him to solitude. In Thebes, this son was observed with a mix of wonder and unease. Amphitryon, a seasoned warrior, decided that this strength must be guided. He summoned to the child the best teachers the city could offer. Thus, Heracles, still at a tender age, received an education few mortals could hope for. Eumolpus, a poet and singer, taught him the art of the lyre. The young boy, whose hands were made for wielding weapons, had to learn to caress the strings and draw harmonious sounds. But his vigor often broke the instrument. It is said that one day, irritated by the severity of his music teacher Linus, he struck him with such a violent blow that he sent him lifeless to the ground. This terrible, thoughtless act chilled his mother and father with dread. It was feared that Hera's wrath, lurking behind the child's destiny, had already darkened his heart. To prevent the city from condemning Heracles for this murder, Amphitryon sent his son far from the walls, to the countryside, so that he might learn to discipline his strength through labor and nature. There, among the herds, Heracles discovered the harshness and peace of the fields. He wielded the hoe like a weapon, clearing in one day what a man would have accomplished in a week. The shepherds admired him, but many also feared his raw power, for sometimes, in his childish games, he unintentionally injured those who came too close. Yet, it was in this solitude that he learned to love animals and listen to the whispers of the wind in the hills. But already, the first trials rose on his path. A gigantic lion from the mountains of Kithaeron terrorized the region. No hunter dared confront it. It ravaged herds, tore nets, and its roars echoed at night like wild thunder. Heracles, barely an adolescent, decided to face it. He took his wooden club, which he had crafted himself, and set out alone through the ravines. It is said that the confrontation lasted hours. The lion burst from the thickets, leaping with terrible force, but Heracles seized it with his powerful arms and, ignoring the bite of its claws, brought it down in the dust. At dawn he returned, dragging the beast's bloody carcass, and the shepherds hailed him as a savior. Amphitryon himself, seeing his son covered in sweat and blood, understood that the boy's destiny surpassed that of ordinary men. His exploits continued to multiply. One day, during a banquet hosted by King Thespius, Heracles was invited to stay several days. The king, who had 50 daughters, desired that the blood of Zeus's son mingle with his lineage. Each night, a different young woman was sent to him, and Heracles, in the vigor of his youth, united with them all, unaware of the ruse. Thus 50 sons were born, spreading his blood through many households. But as the child became a young man, he did not content himself with flesh and brute strength. Under the discipline of his teachers, he was initiated into the art of combat. Castor, a master of arms, taught him the use of the spear, sword, and chariot. Each lesson confirmed that he was not merely strong, but possessed astonishing skill. The other young nobles trained alongside him looked with jealousy at this companion who always surpassed them. Yet Heracles remained simple, preferring physical exercises to the arrogance of words. Another episode marked his youth, the duel against King Minyas of Orchomenus. This tyrannical king demanded an annual tribute from Thebes, humiliating the city. Heracles, indignant, took up arms to defend his people. While his companions hesitated, he alone dared to break Minyas's domination. In battle, he killed the king and freed Thebes from this yoke. In gratitude, King Creon of Thebes offered him the hand of his daughter, Megara. Thus, Heracles became not only a celebrated warrior, but also an honored prince. His early exploits made him a figure already legendary. It was whispered in the temples that Zeus had fathered a hero, destined to rival the greatest mythical lineages, surpassing even Perseus and Bellerophon. In hearths, old men recounted to children the first feats of arms of young Heracles, as if the story was already transforming into an epic. But behind every triumph loomed the shadow of the goddess Hera. She watched from afar with rancor. Her successive failures to break the child only fueled her hatred. The more Heracles grew, the more his glory shone. The more Hera's jealousy burned like an unquenchable flame. She bided her time, preparing the cruelest blows that fate could reserve for this illegitimate son. For now, however, Heracles savored youth, vigor, the love of Megara, and the recognition of his peers. He had vanquished lions, confronted kings, liberated peoples, all before reaching maturity. Poets were already singing his name at banquets, blending music and wine as if he were already a demigod. But none knew that the most terrible trials were yet to come. The sons of Zeus, before tasting immortality, must pass through darkness. And for Heracles, the veil of tragedy was already beginning to rise. For Hera's jealous eye forgot nothing, and her vengeance approached with silent steps. Part 3. The Tragedy of Madness, sent by Hera. Heracles' destiny, until then crowned with exploits, suddenly entered a night darker than any battle. Hera's jealousy, long contained, finally struck with relentless cruelty. For the goddess, weary of waiting, decided to attack Zeus's son not through external trials, but by targeting his mind and heart. Heracles was then living in prosperity. He had freed Thebes from tribute, and in reward, King Creon had given him his daughter, Megara, as a wife. From their union were born several children, robust boys with shining eyes, whom their father held in his arms as treasures more precious than all his victories. In his home echoed the laughter of children, songs, and the sounds of feasts. The Thebans honored him, and his days passed under the apparent blessing of the gods. But Hera, from Olympus, gazed upon this peace with rage. To her, seeing the illegitimate offspring of Zeus prosper was an intolerable offense. She resolved to destroy this happiness and strike Heracles where he was most vulnerable, in his love as a father and husband. One night, as the moon rose over the hills and bathed the dwellings in a tranquil glow, Hera descended in silence cloaked in clouds. She touched Heracles' mind with an invisible hand, and the hero's reason tore like a fragile veil. A mist of delirium descended upon him, clouding his eyes and heart. Where his children and wife stood, he believed monstrous enemies appeared, giants with gleaming weapons, creatures come to kill him. Seized by an uncontrollable fury, Heracles grabbed his weapons. Megara's cries rang through the house, but in his ears they transformed into the howls of enemy warriors. One by one, he struck his sons, believing he was felling adversaries. Blood splattered the walls. The children's toys rolled on the floor, mingled with tears. Megara tried to restrain him, but the club fell upon her like on an enemy shadow. The house, which that morning still echoed with laughter, became a silent tomb. When dawn finally broke, the madness dissipated like a departing storm. Heracles, panting, discovered around him the bodies of his children and wife, lying in silence. His hands were covered in blood, his weapons still warm from the horror they had caused. And in his mind, the truth struck like a thunderbolt. He had massacred those he loved most. A terrible, heart-wrenching cry then rang out, carried far by the hills. The Thebans, awakened by this howl, understood that the hero was struck by a divine curse. Heracles, kneeling among the corpses, wept like a child torn by a pain no battle could have caused. His tears burned his cheeks, his body trembled, and in his eyes shone infinite distress. Priests and sages were summoned. All whispered that such a crime could not remain unpurified. But none dared directly accuse Zeus's son. Many feared his wrath, others pitied his fate, for it was evident a divine hand had guided his madness. Yet Heracles himself sought no excuse. Crushed by shame and guilt, he refused all comfort. The weight of his act was unbearable. He had destroyed with his own hands the family he loved. Amphitryon and Alcmene, his parents, tried to soothe him. But Heracles could not remain in Thebes amidst blood-stained memories. Fleeing the city, he wandered the roads, his gaze lost, his club dragging behind him. His steps led him to Delphi, where the Pythia delivered Apollo's oracles. For in his distress he had but one desire, to find purification, to cleanse his soul of this crime, and to submit to the judgment of the gods. The temple of Delphi rose in the mountains, surrounded by sacred olive trees and the scent of incense. Heracles knelt before the altar, his tears still flowing. The Pythia, inspired by Apollo, gazed at him long, then spoke in a solemn voice that echoed through the hall. Heracles, son of Zeus and Alcmene, your crime is great, but your destiny is greater still. You will find purification not in oblivion, but in trial. You will be a slave to a man weaker than you, and under his orders you will perform impossible tasks. Only then, after suffering and triumphing, will you obtain redemption. These words struck Heracles like chains. To be a slave to another man, he who surpassed all mortals, he who had defied kings and vanquished monstrous beasts, was the ultimate humiliation. But he had no choice. To atone for the blood of his children, he had to submit. The oracle specified the name of the one he would serve, Eurystheus, king of Mycenae, the very one whose birth Hera had hastened to place him before Heracles in the order of kingship. Thus, the goddess's vengeance unfolded in all its cruelty. The greatest of heroes would be reduced to the role of a servant, chained to the whims of a weak king, driven to perform the most terrible tasks. When Heracles left Delphi, his steps were heavy, but his gaze had regained a spark. He now knew that his life no longer belonged to him. Every breath would be dedicated to repairing the irreparable. And in the silence of the gods, he still heard the cries of Megara and his children like a lament that would haunt his soul until his death. Thus ended Heracles' youth, not in glory, but in blood and madness. The man who had vanquished lions and defeated kings was now a criminal in search of redemption. But this tragedy was only the prelude, for from the darkness of his crime would arise the greatest epic, that of the 12 labors, insane trials where he would face monsters, seas, the underworld, and the gods themselves. And above him, in the cold brilliance of Olympus, Hera smiled. Chapter 2. The Shadow of Redemption. Part 1. The Pythia of Delphi and the announcement of the 12 labors. The wind blew over the Parnassus mountains, caressing the motionless pines and the rocks silvered with light. There, at the summit, stood the sanctuary of Delphi, the vibrant heart of sacred Greece. Pilgrims flocked there from all cities, for it was there that Apollo, through the mouth of the Pythia, revealed the designs of the gods to mortals. It was to this place that Heracles walked, burdened by the weight of his crime. Each step echoed like a lament in the valleys, and the dust of the road clung to his bare feet. Since the tragedy that had annihilated his family, he wandered, his mind consumed by remorse. His colossal strength, once a source of pride, now seemed to him a curse. In his dreams, he endlessly saw Megara's face, her eyes filled with terror, and the silenced laughter of his children. As he approached the sanctuary, he saw the sacred columns bathed in incense, the golden statues, and the priests in procession. But his heart felt neither awe nor pride, only a burning thirst for atonement. He climbed the steps, passed through the crowds of supplicants, and entered the temple where Apollo's eternal fire burned. The Pythia, draped in white, sat upon the sacred tripod, breathing the mysterious vapors rising from the earth's depths. Her eyes veiled, her voice rose, foreign and solemn. Heracles knelt, his hand still stained with the memory of spilled blood. Then the prophetess spoke, as if Apollo himself resonated in the marble hall. Heracles, son of Zeus and Alcmene, you who have defiled your home with the blood of your children, know that the gods have not abandoned you. Your fault is immense, but your destiny is greater still. Redemption awaits you in trial, not in oblivion. You must serve a man weaker than you, a mortal king whose shadow will be your master. Under his orders, you will perform tasks no mortal could accomplish. Only then, after passing through pain and victory, will you be purified, and your glory will rival that of the gods. At these words, Heracles raised his head. His eyes shone with a mix of shame and resolve. To be a slave to another man, he, the strongest of the living, was a burden he had never imagined. But he accepted without protest, for he knew that only this path could erase the horror of his crime. The Pythia specified the name of the master awaiting him, Eurystheus, king of Mycenae. A cruel irony of fate, it was this same Eurystheus whose birth Hera had hastened to make him reign before Heracles. Thus, Zeus's son would be forced to serve one who was but a pawn of the god's will, a weak king, yet upheld by divine decree. When Heracles left the temple, the sun shone above Parnassus, but for him the light had a bitter taste. He now knew what the future held. Insane tasks, battles beyond the imaginable, humiliations without number. Yet, deep in his soul, a new flame was awakening. Perhaps these trials, however terrible, would be the opportunity to transform his pain into greatness. He walked toward Mycenae, his steps resounding on the stone roads. Travelers who crossed his path turned to watch him pass, His massive silhouette, somber gait, and burning gaze inspired both awe and admiration. All knew that a mysterious destiny accompanied him, and that the gods, in silence, guided his steps. In Mycenae, Eurystheus awaited him. This king, also a descendant of Perseus, lived surrounded by guards and advisors, but his nature was weak and fearful. When he saw Heracles approach, so tall, so imposing, so akin to a god, he trembled inwardly. Yet Apollo's decree gave him authority over this extraordinary man. With a mix of fear and satisfaction, he welcomed Heracles, then imposed the first of his tasks. But before naming the trials, he ordered that the divine decree be respected in all its rigor. Heracles would be his servant for 12 full years. During this time, he would not act of his own will, but only according to Eurystheus's orders. If he triumphed, purification would be granted, and his name would enter eternity. But if he failed, he would perish like a mere mortal, and his memory would vanish. Thus began the cycle of the 12 labors, these exploits destined to measure not only the hero's strength, but also his endurance of suffering, humiliation, and the gods' cunning. Already, Hera, from the heights of Olympus, watched the scene with a bitter smile. Her plan was unfolding as she wished. Zeus's son, subjected to an inferior master, would be broken by impossible tasks. But what Hera had not foreseen was that these trials, far from extinguishing Heracles' flame, would fuel it. Each victory would be a step toward immortal glory, each suffering a stride toward apotheosis. And already the first labor was announced. The Nemean Lion, a monstrous beast with impenetrable skin, ravaging the countryside and mocking spears and swords. There would begin the long path of blood, sweat, and greatness that would make Heracles not only a hero, but an eternal legend. Under the skies of Greece, the winds carried his name, and the gods, silent, knew that Heracles' story was entering its most terrible and glorious phase. Part 2. The Nemean Lion and the Lernaean Hydra. Eurystheus, seated in his palace at Mycenae, observed Heracles with barely concealed fear. The king knew he could never match this man in strength or even courage, but the gods had given him power over him. It was with a mix of fear and satisfaction that he pronounced the first task. You will go to Nemea, a land ravaged by a monstrous lion. Its skin is invulnerable to weapons, and no hunter has ever managed to slay it. If you triumph, you will prove your worth. If you fail, you will perish like the others. Heracles bowed, silent. He did not protest, for he had sworn to submit. But deep within, he sensed Hera's shadow, behind every word of Eurystheus. Thus began the march toward his first labor. The hills of Nemea stretched beneath a stormy sky. The villages were deserted, the inhabitants barricaded behind closed doors. Everywhere were massacred herds, bleached bones, and claw marks on tree trunks. The lion's roar echoed through the valleys, terrifying men and beasts alike. Heracles ventured alone into the forest. He carried its club, forged by his hands from an olive trunk, and a bow with sharpened arrows. His steps crunched the dead leaves, and his breath mingled with the wind. Suddenly, the lion appeared. Monstrous, gigantic, it had eyes burning like embers and a mane like a crown of flames. Its roars shook the ground. Heracles drew his bow and fired his arrows, but they bounced off the beast's impenetrable skin as if striking bronze. The lion lunged at him, claws extended, fangs gleaming. The battle was terrible. Heracles dodged its leaps, struck with his club, but the monster's skin resisted everything. Then he understood. Only his bare strength could defeat a creature that weapons could not harm. He abandoned his weapons and threw himself at the lion with bare hands. The struggle lasted long, each roar echoing through the valley like thunder. Finally, wrapping his arms around the beast's neck, Heracles strangled it, his chest heaving with effort, his muscles taut like ropes. When the lion collapsed, the forest regained its silence. Heracles, covered in sweat and dust, gazed at the creature's body, but a question remained: how to skin this invincible hide? Knives broke, blades slipped without piercing the fur. Then Athena, compassionate, descended discreetly and whispered in his ear, "Use the lion's claws to cut its skin." Heracles followed this advice, and with the beast's own weapons, he was able to flay it. Thus, he donned the lion's impenetrable skin, draping it over his shoulders like armor, the monster's maw forming a fearsome helmet. Henceforth, no iron, no arrow could harm him. It was clad in this trophy that he returned to Mycenae. But Eurystheus, seeing Heracles return triumphant and clad in the lion's skin, was seized with terror. The king hid behind his walls, ordering that henceforth orders would be given from a distance, for he feared facing this hero who had become even more terrifying than the monsters he slew. Barely had this first labor been accomplished when Eurystheus imposed the second. He believed this one would be fatal. Go to Argolis, near the marsh of Lerna. There lives a creature born of Typhon and Echidna, the Hydra with 9 heads. Its breath poisons the air. Its bites kill instantly. And when one head is cut off, 2 grow back in its place. Bring me its carcass, if you have the strength. Heracles, without a word, accepted again. He left Mycenae and marched toward the misty marshes where the Hydra reigned. The peasants fled this place, for even the trees seemed to die there, blackened by the monster's venomous breath. The stagnant water exhaled a fetid odor, and an oppressive silence reigned, broken only by the hissing of serpents. There, among the reeds, the Hydra emerged. Its scaly body gleamed like bronze, and from its neck rose 9 monstrous heads, hissing and spitting corrosive venom. Their eyes blazed like torches in the mist. Heracles brandished his club and threw himself into battle. Each blow shattered a head, but immediately 2 new ones sprouted, more terrible still. The fight seemed endless, and already the poison burned the air, suffocating the hero. Then he called for help from his nephew Iolaus, who had followed him discreetly. Inspired by Athena, Iolaus lit wooden torches, and each time Heracles cut off a head, he cauterized the wound with blazing fire, preventing regeneration. Little by little, the heads fell without regrowing. Finally, Heracles severed the central immortal head. It writhed still, hissing with hatred, but he buried it under a heavy stone, imprisoning it for eternity. From the beast's mutilated body, he collected the black, deadly venom, dipping the tips of his arrows in it. Henceforth, every arrow he shot would carry the Hydra's bite, inevitable and fatal. But when he reported his victory to Eurystheus, the king, seeking to diminish his glory, refused to count this labor. He declared that Heracles had not triumphed alone, since Iolaus had helped him. Thus, the hero would have to complete not 10, but 12 labors. Heracles remained silent, accepting without protest. But in his heart, he knew that each battle brought him closer to redemption. The lion's blood and the Hydra's venom were etched in his memory as the first steps of a bloody path, at the end of which he might find peace. And as he walked away, his immense shadow outlined against the hills, the Greeks began to sing of these exploits, for in banquets and public squares rhapsodes took up his name, and the legend of Heracles, son of Zeus, took shape under the stars. Part 3. The Erymanthian Boar and the Ceryneian Hind. After the roar of the Nemean Lion and the venomous hisses of the Lernaean Hydra, Heracles stood already as a hero whose exploits circulated through all the cities of Greece. But Eurystheus, increasingly terrified by his strength, grew only more cruel in his orders. Each of Heracles' victories fed Hera's rancor and the king's jealousy. That is why he entrusted him with 2 new trials, believing this time to exhaust or drive him to death. The first was that of the Ceryneian Hind. This creature, sacred to Artemis, goddess of the hunt, was not a monster to slay, but a divine being to capture alive. Its coat gleamed like gold under the sun, and its antlers shone with silver. It ran faster than the wind, crossing rivers like lightning and vanishing into forests before the eye could follow. Heracles was ordered to capture it without spilling its blood, for harming a beast consecrated to Artemis would provoke the wrath of Olympus. The hero, accepting this task with humility, understood that this was not about strength, but patience. He set out alone, following the hind's tracks through the mountains of Arcadia. A whole year passed. Day after day, Heracles pursued the creature through forests, plains, and valleys. The seasons changed around him. Winter whitened the peaks. Spring brought forth flowers. Summer burned the lands, but the hunt did not cease. Sometimes he glimpsed the hind's golden gleam in the distance, but it vanished at once. Finally, at the break of a clear dawn near the river Ladon, Heracles saw the hind drinking. Silent as a shadow, he drew his bow, but not to kill. He loosed a light arrow that lodged between the tendons of its leg without spilling blood. The hind stumbled, and Heracles seized it in his powerful arms. But as he set off, Artemis herself appeared before him, radiant with light, accompanied by her brother Apollo. Her voice echoed through the valley, cold and fearsome. "Mortal, how dare you touch my sacred creature?" Heracles bowed deeply and answered with humility, "Goddess, I did not act of my own will. It is the oracle that commanded me to serve Eurystheus, and it is he who imposed this task. Never would I have harmed what is consecrated to you." Artemis, moved by his sincerity and submission to fate, softened her anger. She permitted him to take the hind to Mycenae, on the condition that he release it afterward. Thus Heracles, bound by the will of the gods, escaped their wrath and accomplished the third of his trials. But Eurystheus was not satisfied. His jealousy, fueled by Hera, led him to assign a new, even more formidable mission: to capture alive the Erymanthian Boar. This monstrous, gigantic, and furious animal ravaged the mountainous lands of Arcadia. Its sharp tusks plowed fields. Its roars drove shepherds to flee, and no hunter dared approach it. Heracles set out through dense forests and snowy ravines. On his way, he stopped at the cave of the centaur Pholus, a wise and hospitable creature. Pholus welcomed him, offering wine and simple fare. But the wine, sacred, belonged to all centaurs, and when its scent spread, the others rushed in, drunk with anger. A quarrel broke out, escalating into combat. Heracles had to defend himself. His arrows, dipped in the Hydra's venom, struck the centaurs, and many perished under their deadly tips. Others fled, and among them Chiron, the wisest, was wounded by mistake. He, the immortal teacher of heroes, suffered from an incurable wound, for no remedy could heal the Hydra's poison. This was an immense pain for Heracles. He had not meant to harm one he so respected, but fate, once again, mingled glory with tragedy. After this drama, he resumed his journey. In the Erymanthian mountains, snow covered the slopes in a pristine veil. The boar's roar echoed through the icy valleys. Heracles tracked it relentlessly, pursuing it through ravines and forests. Finally, on a snowy plateau, he cornered it. The monster charged, its tusks gleaming like spears. It rushed with fury, churning the snow with its hooves. Heracles waited, then with a powerful leap, threw himself upon it. The struggle was fierce. The hero dug his arms into the beast's flanks, which thrashed with savage rage. But little by little, Heracles' colossal strength prevailed. He rolled the boar in the snow, seized its legs, and wrestling against its fury, subdued it alive. Thus he descended from the mountains, carrying the roaring monster on his shoulders. When he arrived in Mycenae, the inhabitants rushed to see, stunned by the spectacle. The boar, immense, still struggled, but nothing could escape the hero's grip. Eurystheus, at the sight of this creature, was seized with panic. He hid in a bronze jar, ordering that he be concealed from the hero and the beast. Heracles, mocking, set the boar before the palace gates, and the trembling king had to admit that his servant had triumphed again. Thus ended these new trials. One demanded patience and cunning, the other strength and bravery. But both revealed that Heracles was not merely a brutal warrior, he was capable of endurance, discipline, and intelligence. Yet each victory fed Hera's hatred and Eurystheus's humiliation. Already new labors were being prepared, ever more terrible, and Heracles, bearing the heavy skin of the Nemean Lion on his shoulders, pressed forward without faltering, for he knew that behind each trial lay redemption. And in the valleys of Greece, poets began to sing not only of his battles, but also of his patience, his pain, and his greatness. For the name of Heracles was becoming greater than that of a mere man. He was the very image of the eternal struggle between the weight of fate and the strength of mortals. Chapter 3. The Trials of the Impossible. Part 1. The Augean Stables and the Stymphalian Birds. Heracles' exploits spread throughout Greece. Already in banquets they sang of the death of the Nemean Lion, the victory over the Hydra, the infinite patience with the Ceryneian Hind, and the capture of the Erymanthian Boar. But Eurystheus, terrified by this growing glory, sought ever new labors, hoping at last to see the hero succumb. Under Hera's insidious inspiration, he ordered 2 trials that seemed as absurd as they were impossible, to clean the Augean stables and to confront the birds of Lake Stymphalus. King Augeas ruled over Elis. His wealth came from his countless herds. Thousands of oxen grazed on his fertile lands, but his vast and ancient stables had not been cleaned for decades. The fetid stench spread for leagues, and the heaps of dung formed mountains, poisoning the air and rivers. Eurystheus, with a cruel smile, ordered Heracles to clean these stables in a single day, a humiliating task, unworthy of a hero, and yet more insurmountable than slaying a monster. Heracles, without protest, went to Elis. Augean, skeptical, received him in his palace. The king laughed at the idea that one man alone could accomplish what hundreds of slaves had never managed. Heracles then proposed a deal. If he succeeded in a day, Augean would give him a share of his herds. The king agreed, convinced he had nothing to fear. The next day, Heracles surveyed the gigantic stables. The stench was suffocating. The walls crumbled under accumulated filth. But he took neither shovel nor broom. He approached the rivers Alpheus and Peneus, flowing nearby. With his powerful hands, he dug channels, diverted the river's courses, and sent their tumultuous waters rushing into the stables. The torrent surged, sweeping away years of filth in an instant, cleaning the stones and carrying the refuse to the sea. In one day, the feat was accomplished. The stables gleamed, purified by the force of the waters. Heracles, triumphant, went to claim his reward. But Augean, treacherous, reneged on his oath, claiming the order came from Eurystheus, and thus the agreement was invalid. Furious at this betrayal, Heracles left Elis, but he swore that one day he would return to punish Augean and his perfidy. When he reported his exploit to Mycenae, Eurystheus, advised by Hera, refused to count this task, claiming that Heracles had demanded payment. Thus, 2 of his labors would be annulled, the Hydra and the stables. It was no longer 10 but 12 trials that awaited him. The next was even more formidable. In Arcadia, near Lake Stymphalian, lived a swarm of monstrous birds. These creatures, consecrated to Ares, had bronze wings and beaks sharp as blades. Their feathers, launched in flight, pierced men like arrows. Each day they swooped down on the countryside, devouring crops and sowing death among the inhabitants. Heracles advanced toward the dark marshes of the lake. The reeds rustled with an unsettling murmur, and the sky seemed darkened by the countless wings of the carnivorous birds. The hero, hidden in the thickets, surveyed the fearsome swarm and realized that brute strength alone would not suffice. Then Athena, his faithful protector, gave him a precious object, bronze castanets, forged by Hephaestus. These instruments resounded with a clamor so powerful it could terrify the wildest creatures. Heracles climbed a height overlooking the lake and sounded the castanets. The noise erupted like metallic thunder, shaking the reeds in the air. The birds, seized with panic, took flight in disarray, their shrill cries drowning out the tumult. Then Heracles loosed his arrows, dipped in the Hydra's venom. One by one the creatures fell, pierced, their bronze wings sinking into the marshes. The survivors fled far away, never to return to trouble Arcadia. Thus, by ingenuity as much as strength, Heracles triumphed again. But this triumph had a bitter taste, for he now saw that his victories were not enough to appease Hera nor satisfy Eurystheus. Each time he returned with a task accomplished, the king sought to deny it, diminish it, annul it. The hero advanced through a labyrinth of cunning and hatred where glory mingled with humiliation. Yet he did not rebel, for deep in his soul he still heard the cries of his dead children, the lament of Megara. His strength had no purpose but to atone for this crime. No matter Eurystheus's injustice, no matter Hera's cruelty, each labor accomplished was a stone added to the edifice of his redemption. The peasants of Elis and Arcadia, witnesses to his exploits, began to honor him as a savior. In villages, old men recounted how he had cleaned the immense stables by diverting the rivers. Children, in their games, mimicked the clang of the bronze castanets and the rain of birds falling from the sky. Everywhere, his name blended with songs, carried as a beacon of hope in a world where monsters and tyrants seemed invincible. And yet, at the summit of Olympus, Hera did not smile. Each of Heracles' victories, far from breaking him, made him more famous, closer to eternal glory. The goddess swore to place before him ever more terrible trials, hoping that one day at last the strength of Zeus's son would break. But Heracles, advancing without detour, knew no rest. His shoulders, covered with the skin of the Nemean Lion, bore the weight of a destiny nothing could divert. The labors followed one another, and already the silhouette of the furious Cretan bull and the carnivorous mares of Diomedes loomed on the horizon. The path to redemption was still long, but each step, each battle, each humiliation brought Heracles not only closer to purification, but also to immortality. Part 2. The Cretan Bull and the Mares of Diomedes. After purifying the Augean stables and driving away the swarm of bronze birds from Lake Stymphalian, Heracles had no moment's respite. Eurystheus, advised by Hera, strove ceaselessly to place before him ever more distant, more dangerous trials, hoping that one day the hero would succumb. The exploits already accomplished were enough to feed the glory of poets, but his destiny demanded more. It was then that Eurystheus imposed two new tasks: to capture the furious Cretan bull and to seize the carnivorous mares of Diomedes. The Cretan bull was a prodigious beast, once offered by Poseidon to King Minos as a sign of divine favor. But Minos, instead of sacrificing the animal as he had promised, kept it for himself. So Poseidon, angered, drove the bull mad, and it now ravaged the entire island, trampling fields, destroying crops, and toppling walls. Heracles set sail for Crete, embarking on a ship fragrant with resinous wood. The frothy waves carried his vessel, and already in the distance, the majestic island crowned with mountains came into view. There, Minos still reigned in his palace at Knossos, among vibrant columns and frescoes. The king, impressed by the hero's stature, welcomed him with respect. "If you manage to capture this beast," he said, "you will free my people from a scourge." Heracles set out to find the bull. He found it in a vast plain where the animal devastated everything in its path. Its horns gleamed like steel, its eyes flashed with lightning, and its bellows resounded like earthquakes. The battle was titanic. The bull charged, its hooves raising clouds of dust. Heracles threw himself upon it, seized its horns, and in a fierce struggle pinned the beast to the ground. His bronze-like arms gripped the animal until it was exhausted. Then he bound it securely and led it to the sea. The crossing was terrible. The bull struggled ceaselessly, rocking the ship, threatening to capsize it. But Heracles, clinging to the ropes, managed to bring it to the mainland. In Mycenae, he delivered it to Eurystheus, who, terrified, let the animal escape. It is said that the bull then wandered through Greece, still sowing fear, until another hero, Theseus, vanquished it in Attica. The next task led Heracles to Thrace, a harsh and wild kingdom at the edge of the known world. There reigned Diomedes, a cruel king and son of Ares, god of war. His fame was not based on bravery, but on horror. He possessed 4 monstrous mares fed on human flesh. Their bites were ferocious. Their neighs resounded like war cries. Capturing them seemed impossible. Heracles crossed the wind-swept plains, accompanied by a few loyal companions. They reached Diomedes' palace, guarded by fierce warriors. The king, haughty, refused all dialogue and unleashed his mares against the strangers. The beasts, foaming, leaped forward, their eyes blazing with rage. Then Heracles sprang into action. His club shattered the skulls of the guards. His arms swept aside those who opposed him. Finally, he faced Diomedes himself. The king, armed with a spear and sword, confronted Zeus's son. The clash was violent, but Heracles' divine strength prevailed. He overthrew Diomedes, seized him, and in a relentless act, threw him as prey to his own mares. The beasts, sated by their master's flesh, ceased their fury and let themselves be tamed. Thus, Heracles was able to subdue them and bring them to Mycenae. When Eurystheus saw these foaming monsters approach, he ordered them released, fearing they would devastate the city. The mares were then consecrated to Artemis, who made them vanish into the wild plains. These 2 labors, one across the sea, the other at the edge of Thrace, revealed once again Heracles' dual nature, invincible warrior and tamer of beasts, bringer of chaos, and restorer of order. His fame crossed Greece's borders. Already beyond the seas his name was whispered, and foreign kings feared that one day his club might strike their lands. Yet, at the heart of these victories, the hero remained somber. For each exploit accomplished did not erase the shadows of his past. Each night, in silence, he still saw the faces of Megara and his children, and he knew that no triumph could soothe this wound. His labors were not a quest for glory, but a slow and painful march toward redemption. Eurystheus, however, never ceased to tremble. He had hoped to see Heracles perish far away, swallowed by the sea or torn apart by ferocious beasts. But each time, the hero returned, more formidable still, bearing on his shoulders the living proof of his victory. The king then decided to assign him even more terrible trials, hoping that distance and the impossible would finally defeat him. Already, on the horizon, loomed the silhouette of the Amazons, fierce warrior women with gleaming bows, and beyond, the rumor of the monstrous herds of Geryon. Part 3. The Belt of Hippolyta and the Cattle of Geryon. After the furious Cretan bull and the cannibalistic mares of Diomedes, Heracles had already traveled seas and distant lands. But Eurystheus, increasingly anxious about his invincible servant, sought to send him ever farther, to the edges of the known world. Hera, in the shadows, still whispered perilous tasks in the king's ear, hoping the hero would finally be broken. It was then that Eurystheus imposed 2 formidable trials: to bring back the belt of Hippolyta queen of the Amazons, and to capture the cattle of Geryon, monsters from the world's extremities. The fame of the Amazons already resounded throughout Greece. These warrior women, daughters of Ares, lived on the shores of the Black Sea in cities where no man dared rule. Their discipline was that of steel, their bows sang like the storm, and their cavalry sowed terror. Their queen, Hippolyta, wore a golden belt given by Ares himself, a symbol of her authority and power. Heracles set sail to reach their kingdom. The journey was long, punctuated by storms and troubling dreams. At last, he landed on the shores where the Amazon's walls rose. Against all expectations, Hippolyta came to meet him, captivated by the hero's grandeur and nobility. She promised him the belt without combat, as a gift of respect and admiration. But Hera, seeing the task being accomplished without bloodshed, took the form of an Amazon and spread the rumor that Heracles intended to abduct their queen. At once, the warriors rose, bows drawn, spears raised, and the plain echoed with the furious gallop of their horses. Then, battle erupted. Arrows rained like a black cloud, but Heracles, protected by the skin of the Nemean Lion, advanced unfaltering, his club crushing the enemy ranks. The ground trembled under the blows, and the battle lasted hours. Finally, Hippolyta herself fell, a victim of the tumult, and Heracles seized the blood-stained belt. He departed heavy-hearted, for he had not sought this massacre, but fate and Hera's jealousy always made his victories bitter. Soon after, Eurystheus announced an even more terrible task, to seize the cattle of Geryon. This monster lived beyond the ocean, on the island of Erythea, at the edge of the west. Geryon was a gigantic being, with 3 bodies joined at the waist, 3 heads, 3 chests, 3 pairs of arms and legs. His strength rivaled that of the Titans, and his cattle, guarded by the dog Orthus, brother of Cerberus, were among the most feared in the world. To undertake this journey, Heracles had to cross unexplored lands. He traversed the arid Libyan desert, where the sun burned without mercy. There, in the furnace of the desert, he faced the giant Antaeus, son of the earth, invincible as long as he touched the ground. Each time Heracles threw him down, the giant regained vigor, nourished by his mother, Gaia. Then, understanding the secret of his strength, Heracles seized him and held him aloft until his life faded. Continuing his journey, he reached the edge of the known world. There, he erected 2 gigantic columns, separating Europe from Africa. These were the pillars of Hercules, forever marking the passage to the infinite ocean. On the island of Erythea, the final battle awaited. Orthus, the monstrous dog, lunged first, its 2 heads howling, fangs gleaming. But Heracles felled it with a single blow of his club. Its keeper, the herdsman Eurytion, tried to resist, but the hero struck him without mercy. Then came Geryon, immense, terrifying, his 3 bodies advancing like an army. Each hand brandished a weapon, and his voices thundered together like a hurricane. The duel was titanic. Geryon struck from all sides, his blows raining like storms, but Heracles resisted, his bow loosing arrows dipped in the Hydra's venom. One struck Geryon in the flank, and the monster collapsed, his 3 chests groaning in a single lament. Thus, Heracles seized the cattle, a colossal herd whose bellows resounded like thunder. He brought them back through distant lands, facing further obstacles. Kings seeking to steal the beasts, peoples terrified by their passage. But none could resist him. Finally, he returned to Mycenae, delivering to Eurystheus the belt of Hippolyta and the monstrous cattle of Geryon. The king, trembling, remained behind his walls, unable to face the one he called his servant. Each of Heracles' triumphs humiliated him further, and in his heart hatred grew. These two labors, one against the daughters of Ares, the other against a monster of the world's edge, carried Heracles ever farther, ever closer to the impossible. All of Greece now sang his name. He was no longer merely a local hero, but a figure whose fame crossed seas and continents. And yet, each victory left a bitter taste in him, for Hera, relentless, never ceased to sow pain at the heart of his triumphs. Soon would come the time of the final labors, even more formidable, the garden of the Hesperides, where immortal dragons kept watch, and the gates of the underworld, where Cerberus growled. Chapter 4. Toward Immortality. Part 1. The Garden of the Hesperides and Atlas the Titan. After retrieving the belt of Hippolyta and the monstrous cattle of Geryon, Heracles believed he had reached the ends of the world, but Eurystheus, secretly advised by Hera, imposed upon him an even more impossible task: to bring back the golden apples from the garden of the Hesperides. These fruits, offered by Gaia as a wedding gift to Hera when she united with Zeus, grew at the edge of the world in a marvelous orchard. The Hesperides, daughters of the dusk, kept watch over them, their gentle songs resonating like caresses. But above all, a monstrous dragon named Ladon, with 100 hissing heads, guarded the sacred tree. No mortal had ever approached these fruits. Heracles once again set out toward the unknown. It was a long and perilous journey, for no one knew precisely where the garden was located. He first crossed Libya, where King Busiris reigned. This tyrant, obeying dark oracles, sacrificed every foreigner to Zeus, believing this would ensure his kingdom's prosperity. Heracles was seized, chained, and led to the altar. But when the sacred knife was raised over him, he broke his bonds, overthrew his captors, and killed Busiris himself, putting an end to his bloody sacrifices. Continuing his journey, he reached the Caucasus Mountains. There, he encountered a terrible sight. The Titan Prometheus, brother of Atlas, chained to a rock for having given fire to mankind. Each day, a monstrous eagle came to devour his liver, and each night the wound regenerated. Moved by compassion, Heracles shot a poisoned arrow that pierced the bird, freeing the Titan from his torment. In gratitude, Prometheus told his liberator how to find the garden of the Hesperides. Only Atlas, his brother, knew how to approach it. Thus, Heracles marched to the edge of the world, where the sky seemed to rest on the pillars of the horizon. There stood Atlas, the immense Titan, condemned to bear the celestial vault on his shoulders for eternity. His colossal arms supported the stars, his knees buckled under the weight of the world, and his eyes burned with infinite weariness. Heracles approached and spoke with a firm voice. "Atlas, brother of Prometheus, I need you. I am ordered to bring back the golden apples from the garden of the Hesperides. You alone can enter that sacred orchard, for you know its paths and guardians." Atlas, initially wary, saw in him an opportunity to relieve himself of his burden. "I will help you," he said, "but you must hold the sky in my place while I go to fetch the fruits." Without hesitation, Heracles agreed. He knelt beneath the immense vault, placed his powerful shoulders against the sphere of the world, and felt the weight of the stars crash upon him. His muscles tensed, his veins swelled, and his breath grew heavy, but he held firm. Atlas, relieved, departed for the garden. The Hesperides, charmed by his divine blood, did not oppose him, and he picked 3 golden apples, sparkling like miniature suns. He returned, but seeing Heracles bent under the burden of the sky, a treacherous thought crossed his mind. "You are strong, son of Zeus, but why not leave this burden to me forever? I will carry the apples to Eurystheus, and you will hold the sky on your shoulders for eternity." Heracles immediately understood the ruse, but without showing his anger, he replied calmly, "So be it, Atlas. But before you leave, take the sky from my shoulders for a moment, so I may place a cushion on my neck to lessen the burden's sting." Atlas, deceived by the simplicity of these words, took the sky back onto his shoulders. Then Heracles seized the apples and walked away, leaving the Titan to resume his eternal punishment. Thus, through cunning as much as strength, he triumphed once again. Heracles brought the golden apples to Mycenae, but Eurystheus, fearing to keep a divine gift, returned them to Athena, who took them back to the sacred garden, where they were meant to remain forever. This labor marked one of the hero's greatest exploits, for he had confronted not only monsters, but the very weight of the sky, proving that his strength was not only in his arms, but also in his mind, capable of outwitting the cunning of Titans. Throughout Greece, rhapsodes now sang the story of the hero who had borne the celestial vault. Elders recounted that even the stars had leaned down that day to witness his bravery, and in the temples it was whispered that Zeus, in secret, gazed upon his son with growing pride, though Hera's hatred continued to loom like a shadow. But already Eurystheus was preparing the most terrible command, to send Heracles to the underworld, to wrest from the darkness the monstrous dog guarding the gates of Hades. Part 2. The capture of Cerberus at the gates of the underworld. After bearing the vault of the sky and bringing back the golden apples from the garden of the Hesperides, Heracles had crossed the boundaries of the known world. But Eurystheus, driven by Hera's hatred, reserved for him an even more terrifying trial, the most inhuman of all, to descend into the underworld and bring back Cerberus, the monstrous 3-headed dog that guarded the gates of the realm of the dead. When the order was pronounced, an icy silence swept through the hall, for no mortal dared even to think of entering Hades. The underworld was not merely the abode of departed souls, it was a place of dread, of eternal darkness, watched over by implacable deities. But Heracles, bound by Apollo's decree, bowed once again. Before undertaking this journey, he went to Eleusis, where the priests of the mysteries taught the secret rites of Demeter and Persephone. For no one could descend into the realm of the dead without sacred purification. The priests initiated him, revealing the chants and gestures that protected the soul in the darkness. Heracles, his mind darkened but his heart steadfast, received their blessings and advanced toward the mouth of Hades. The entrance was at Cape Tenarum in Laconia, a gaping cave exhaling a cold breath that seemed to swallow the light. Fishermen and shepherds avoided it, whispering that shadows wandered there at night. Heracles entered, the skin of the Nemean Lion on his shoulders, his club in hand. Gradually, the daylight vanished, replaced by the pale glow of subterranean flames. The underworld opened before him, vast and terrible. He walked along dark shores where the Styx flowed, a cursed river that even the gods feared to swear by falsely. In his boat, Charon, the old ferryman, approached. At first, he refused to let him pass, for only the dead could cross the Styx. But Heracles, revealing the will of the gods, compelled him with his strength and divine radiance. Trembling, Charon let him board his skiff, and the black waters carried the hero to the heart of the realm of shadows. In the distance, the moans of the damned echoed. Heracles glimpsed Tantalus, tormented by eternal thirst, Sisyphus endlessly rolling his boulder, and Ixion bound to his fiery wheel. But he turned his eyes away, for his mission was not to judge the dead, but to confront their guardian. At the center of the underworld stood the palace of Hades, dark and majestic. Persephone, queen of the shadows, sat beside him, beautiful and solemn as a winter night. Heracles knelt before them and spoke with respect. Sovereigns of the subterranean realm, I come not of my own will, but by the command of the gods. Eurystheus has ordered me to bring Cerberus to the world of the living. Grant me permission, and I swear to use no weapons, only my strength. Hades, impassive, gazed at the hero. He knew no mortal had ever dared make such a request, but he respected his courage and sincerity. Then he replied, in a voice that resounded like the rumbling of the depths, "If you can master Cerberus with your bare hands, without sword or arrows, you may take him. But know that no man nor god emerges unscathed from his grasp." Heracles advanced toward the gates of Hades. There, in the darkness, Cerberus appeared. Monstrous, he had 3 roaring heads, each drooling black venom. His neck was ringed with hissing serpents, and his tail ended in a howling dragon. His barks resounded like lightning, and the earth trembled under his steps. The hero stood before the monster, setting his club on the ground. His arms alone would be his weapon. Cerberus lunged, its 3 jaws open, fangs gleaming. Heracles threw himself upon it, seizing 2 of the heads by the throat, while the third bit at his impenetrable skin. The battle was titanic. The serpents coiled around his legs, the venom burned his body, but he held firm. In a superhuman effort, he squeezed, stifling the roars, pinning the monstrous dog against the rock. His muscles trembled, his veins swelled, and his eyes shone with an indomitable light. Finally, after an endless struggle, Cerberus yielded, subdued by the sheer strength of Zeus's son. Then, panting, Heracles seized the monster by its chains and dragged it from the realm of the dead. The shadows parted before him, frightened by the glow of life that still surrounded him. Charon, pale, ferried him back in his skiff. And through the cave of Tenarum, Heracles emerged into the daylight, dragging behind him Cerberus, still roaring, its 3 jaws foaming. When Eurystheus saw the hero approach, holding the guardian of the underworld like a captive dog, he was seized with nameless terror. Trembling, he ordered the monster locked away immediately and begged Heracles to return it to the subterranean realm. Thus, Cerberus was taken back to the underworld, and Heracles, once again, had accomplished the impossible. This labor marked the pinnacle of his trials, for he had not only defeated a monstrous beast, but crossed the boundary between life and death. No other hero, before or after him, had dared to enter Hades and return alive, yet even this triumph did not break Hera's hatred. But throughout Greece, his name now resounded as that of a being more than human, a mortal who had trodden the underworld and gazed upon the kings of the shadows. And in the silence of the heavens, Zeus himself smiled, seeing in his son the promise of eternal glory. Part 3. Later Exploits and Panhellenic Glory. When Heracles returned from the underworld, dragging Cerberus into the daylight, he crossed an invisible threshold. More than a mere hero, he became a being on the verge of divinity, a mortal who had trodden the realm of the dead and emerged alive. His 12 labors, accomplished despite Hera's hatred and Eurystheus' whims, made him the most illustrious of Zeus's sons. But his story did not end there, for once his years of servitude were over, the world continued to demand feats from him. Freed from Eurystheus' commands, Heracles regained his freedom for a time, but he could not remain idle. His strength, courage, and renown called him constantly to new endeavors. Wherever he went, people sought his aid against tyrants, monsters, or scourges. In Thessaly, he fought to deliver the inhabitants from the threat of King Augean, the very one who had refused to pay him for cleaning his stables. Recalling the past betrayal, Heracles raised an army and marched against him. The battle was brief but bloody, and Augean fell, punished for his perfidy. He then faced Cycnus, son of Ares, a cruel warrior who slaughtered travelers to offer them to his father. The duel was fierce, but Heracles, guided by Athena, triumphed, felling yet another offspring of divine brutality. In distant lands, he also battled the sons of Neptune, who threatened sailors and defeated strange creatures born of unions between gods and monsters. His club and venom-tipped arrows sowed terror among all who defied the order of men. But his feats were not limited to combat. Everywhere he left his mark through works that transformed the world. In Arcadia, he diverted rivers to purify the lands. In Elis, he contributed to the founding of sacred rites that, it is said, later gave birth to the Olympic Games, celebrated in his honor. The Greeks, admiring his strength but also his role as a civilizer, began to see him not only as a warrior, but as a benefactor of humanity. Yet tragedy was never far. One day, while staying in Thessaly, he was invited by King Eurytus of Oechalia, renowned for his prodigious bow. Eurytus had promised his daughter Iole's hand to whoever could defeat his sons in archery. Heracles triumphed effortlessly, but the king, fearing his strength and recalling the madness that had once struck him, refused to give him his daughter. Humiliated, Heracles departed, but his heart burned with desire for Iole. This episode would later mark the path to his downfall. In other lands, he joined expeditions alongside other heroes. Some say he took part in the voyage of the Argonauts, facing the perils of the sea in search of the Golden Fleece. But Other traditions claim he left the ship early in the journey, for his strength and destiny were too vast to bend to others' designs. He also visited the Troad, where he saved Princess Hesione, condemned to be devoured by a sea monster sent by Poseidon. Heracles, emerging from the waves, slew the beast and restored her freedom. But here, too, betrayal and bitterness followed, for King Laomedon refused him the promised reward. Heracles swore then to return and destroy Troy, a vow that would later bring misfortune to the city. Through all these adventures, the hero's fame grew. His name crossed Greece's borders, in Asia Minor, in Africa, in distant islands. The one called Alcides, or Heracles, bearer of the club and the lion's skin, was already known. Everywhere sanctuaries rose in his honor, sacrifices were offered to him, and men invoked his strength to protect them from misfortune. Poets and rhapsodes sang his exploits at banquets, comparing his strength to that of the Titans, his glory to that of the gods. Some feared him, for his passage always left a trail of blood and ruin, but many admired him as a protector of the weak and a champion of justice. Yet, despite the glory and honors, Heracles remained haunted. His soul still bore the scar of the madness sent by Hera, and every child's laughter he heard in the villages rekindled the memory of those he had lost. His life, despite its glory, remained an inner exile. Even when crowned with victories, he knew peace would be denied him as long as he walked among men. And Hera, ever lurking in the shadows of Olympus, continued to nurse an inextinguishable hatred against him. Each of his triumphs, each song in his praise, was for her but a crueler affront. She prepared yet new snares, for even if Heracles seemed invincible, he remained mortal, vulnerable to cunning, love, and betrayal. Thus, emerging from his 12 labors, Heracles found no rest. His life was no longer about obedience to Eurystheus. It became a succession of free exploits, but also of conflicts and tragedy. Each victory brought him closer to the gods. Each mistake chained him still to his human condition. But already, in the heavens, fate was weaving the tapestry of his end, for after his Panhellenic glory would come the ultimate trial, that of love and betrayal, which cannot be vanquished with arrows or a club. Chapter 5. The End of a Hero. Part 1. The Final Battles and Deianira's Betrayal. The years passed, and wherever Heracles walked, he left behind the imprint of his strength. His labors had taken him to the ends of the world. His victories echoed in every Greek city. But the higher his name rose, the darker his fate grew. For no mortal, even a son of Zeus, could escape the god's snares, and Hera, relentless, awaited the moment of her ultimate vengeance. After his 12 labors, Heracles continued to perform countless feats. He waged wars, confronted kings, and destroyed rebellious cities. He avenged past betrayals. Thus, he returned against Troy and slew Laomedon, who had deceived him during Hesione's rescue. He marched against Eurytus of Oechalia, who had humiliated him by refusing Iole's hand despite his victory in the archery contest. The city was taken, Eurytus killed, and Iole captured. Heracles, in his desire, kept her by his side, unwittingly preparing his own downfall. For at that time he had married Deianira, daughter of King Oeneus of Calydon. Beautiful and gentle, she followed her husband, despite the weight of his destiny. But the shadow of misfortune already loomed over their union. One day, as they traveled together, they came to a river with a rushing current. There stood the centaur Nessus, who offered to carry Deianira on his back to cross safely. Heracles agreed, but as he swam across the waters himself, he suddenly heard his wife's cries. Nessus was attempting to abduct her. Without hesitation, Heracles drew his bow and shot an arrow dipped in the Hydra's venom. The shaft struck the centaur, who collapsed, mortally wounded, but in his final breath, Nessus wove a treacherous ruse. He said to Deianira, "Collect my blood, mingled with my seed. Keep it carefully. It is a love potion. If ever your husband turns from you to another, anoint his garments with this blood, and his heart will be yours forever." Deianira, innocent and unaware of the poison, obeyed and kept the fatal liquid in an urn. Thus, the seed of betrayal was sown, ready to blossom on the day of destiny. The years passed. Heracles, ever in pursuit of glory, won still more resounding victories. But his heart gradually turned from Deianira, drawn to the young Iole. The rumor of this passion reached his wife's ears, filling her with fear and jealousy. Recalling the dying centaur's words, she believed she held a means to reclaim her husband's love. One day, Heracles prepared to offer a sacrifice to the gods, dressed in a white tunic. Deianira took the garment and anointed it with Nessus's blood, believing she was applying a love charm. She gave it to her husband with tender words, unaware that she bore death in her hands. Heracles donned the tunic and went to the altar, but as the heat of the sacred fire rose, the Hydra's venom contained in Nessus's blood awakened. The tunic blazed with invisible pain. The poison seeped into his flesh, devouring his muscles, burning his bones. Heracles let out a terrible cry, so loud it echoed through the mountains. He tore at the tunic, but it had fused to his skin. Each movement ripped away strips of flesh. His strength, once invincible, was powerless against this inner fire. He rolled on the ground, striking the earth, his roars mingling with the flames of the sacrifice. His companions, horrified, tried to help, but none could remove the cursed garment. Then Heracles understood. It was not his wife's deliberate betrayal, but the long-matured vengeance of Hera accomplished through a centaur's cunning. Deianira, when she learned of the disaster, was seized with despair. She realized too late the fatal mistake she had made. Convinced she had caused the loss of the man she loved, she took her own life, unable to bear the shame or the weight of her fault. Heracles, meanwhile, was consumed by endless agony. His flesh melted, his bones cracked, and yet life refused to leave his body. For he was the son of Zeus, and even pain could not fully break him. In this torment, he understood that his hour was near. Then he made a decision worthy of his greatness. He would not die slowly, consumed by poison, but would choose his own departure in the flames of a pyre. Thus began the march to Mount Oeta, a sacred summit where the winds blew freely and the gods could gaze upon mortals. Heracles, his body broken, but his spirit unyielding, climbed the mountain in silence, still bearing the lion's skin on his shoulders. Each step was torture, but his gaze remained fixed on the summit. There he ordered a pyre of dry wood to be built. His companions, weeping, surrounded him, but he commanded them not to cry. No one can escape their fate. I have slain monsters, crossed the underworld, borne the sky itself. But today, my strength has no other path but that of fire. He lay down on the pyre, his club placed beside him, his bow within reach. The sun, sinking toward the horizon, bathed his silhouette in a red and golden glow. And in the silence, he waited for someone to light the liberating flame. Part 2. Death on the Pyre and Divine Ascension. At the summit of Mount Oeta, the winds sang like celestial voices. The sun, descending toward the horizon, bathed the mountain in a glowing light. Heracles, lying on the dry wood he had ordered piled, breathed with difficulty. The poison of the cursed tunic still consumed his flesh, but his will remained intact. His eyes, shining like flames, reflected the certainty of his fate. His companions, silent, stood around him. None dared to light the pyre, for who would dare set fire to the body of the greatest of heroes, the one who had slain the Nemean Lion, felled the Hydra, borne the sky, and wrested Cerberus from the underworld? All trembled before the grandeur and pain of this moment. Then Heracles spoke in a deep but serene voice. Friends, do not fear. This is not an end, but a passage. I have faced the wrath of the gods, atoned for my fault through the labors, borne the weight of the sky and of my own madness. Today I return to the earth what is mortal in me, but know that the soul of Zeus's son will not perish in the flames. He turned his gaze to the horizon, where the clouds blazed, and added, Light the fire, for it is time. But none dared. The warriors turned away, tears in their eyes. Then came a stranger, a young man passing by, Philoctetes. Moved by the hero's distress and grandeur, he agreed to render this final service. Heracles, in gratitude, gave him his bow and poisoned arrows, weapons feared even by the gods, entrusting him with his legacy. Philoctetes brought a torch to the pyre. The flames rose, timid at first, then roaring. The wood crackled, and soon the smoke ascended to the sky, carrying with it the hero's soul. Heracles uttered no cry. On the contrary, he smiled. His eyes closed gently, and in the roar of the flames his breath faded. But this was not a death like that of men, for at the moment his mortal body was consumed, a thunderclap resounded in the sky. The clouds parted, and a dazzling light descended upon Mount Oeta. The gods themselves, led by Zeus, appeared. Zeus had long watched over his son, though Hera's jealousy had condemned him to countless sufferings. He had let fate run its course, but he could not abandon divine blood to the decay of the grave. In a flash of lightning, he seized Heracles' immortal essence and raised it to the heavens. His mortal body, consumed by the fire, gave way to a divine figure, radiant and immortal. The flames died out, and on the pyre remained only a sacred silence. His companions, witnesses to this prodigy, fell to their knees. They understood that on that day Heracles had crossed the boundary of mortals to join the assembly of the gods. At the summit of Olympus, his welcome was grandiose. The gods rose to receive the one who had suffered more than any other mortal. Even Hera, long his enemy, was forced to set aside her hatred. By Zeus's command, she accepted reconciliation and offered him her daughter Hebe, goddess of eternal youth, in marriage. Thus, the hero marked by pain found peace at last. At the table of the gods, he sat beside his father, sharing nectar and ambrosia. His earthly sufferings faded like dreams, and his name became eternal. On earth, however, his memory remained alive. The Greeks, seeing in his destiny the image of the human struggle against adversity, raised altars in his honor. Everywhere, Heracles was celebrated not only as a warrior, but as a benefactor, a protector, a guide. His image, club in hand, lion skin on his shoulders, was carved on stones, painted on vases, sung in poems. And Mount Oeta, where he had been consumed, became a sacred place. The winds that blew there recalled to travelers the breath of his final moments, and the flames of his pyre seemed to still glow in the red clouds of the sunset. Thus ended the earthly life of Heracles. But it was not an end. It was a transfiguration. For his destiny, greater than that of kings and heroes, was to unite in his person the weight of human suffering and the immortal glory of the gods. And in the sky, when the night blazed with stars, many said they saw his shadow walking among the constellations, forever preserving the memory of his battles and his ascension. Part 3. The apotheosis of Heracles and his eternal place in the heavens. When the flames of Mount Oeta consumed the mortal body of Heracles, the entire world seemed to hold its breath. The winds had calmed, the birds had fallen silent, and even the seas had stilled. Then, in a burst of thunder, Zeus took his son's soul, wresting it from pain to raise it to the peaks of Olympus. Thus ended the hero's earthly life, and his immortality began. In the abode of the gods, the golden gates opened to welcome the child of glory. The Olympians rose at his arrival, each recognizing in him not only power, but also suffering and purification. For no other had borne so heavy a burden, no other had atoned for their faults through such terrible trials. Hera herself, long his bitter enemy, was forced to set aside her wrath. Zeus, in a firm voice, proclaimed the reconciliation. "Enough of hatred, queen of the gods. See how my son has suffered and triumphed. Henceforth he is worthy of eternity." Hera, despite the pride that surged within her, was compelled to assent. To seal this peace, she gave her daughter Hebe, goddess of youth, to Heracles in marriage, offering him the eternal freshness and happiness that earth had denied him. Thus, in the immortal feasts, Heracles took his place at Zeus's right hand, sharing ambrosia and nectar. His past sufferings faded like dreams, and his laughter rang out again, clear and powerful, amidst the divine songs. But on earth, his memory remained vivid, etched in the hearts of men. The Greeks, who had seen in him the protector and liberator, raised temples and altars in his name. In the cities, they sacrificed bulls and rams in his honor, invoking his strength to repel enemies, his courage to inspire warriors, his kindness to protect the weak. It was said he appeared sometimes in the dreams of kings, brandishing his club to show them the path of justice. Shepherds in the countryside swore they had seen him walking in the mist, still bearing the lion skin and guarding their flocks. Sailors, facing storms, called his name and believed they felt his invisible hand guiding their ships through the waves. Over the generations, his cult took 1,000 forms. In Thebes, his birthplace, they still celebrated the child who had strangled 2 serpents in his cradle. In Arcadia, they recited the hunt for the Ceryneian Hind. In Argolis, they told of his victory over the Hydra. In Crete, they remembered the raging bull. And in the farthest reaches of Thrace, the tales of Diomedes' carnivorous mares endured as warnings. Each city preserved a fragment of his memory, and everywhere poets wove these fragments into a single legend, that of the man who had suffered like mortals but triumphed like the gods. Little by little, his name spread beyond Greece itself. Travelers carried his memory to Egypt, where he was likened to ancient protector gods. In Italy, the Etruscans and Romans adopted him as Hercules, building sanctuaries on their soil. His exploits crossed the borders of continents, reaching the ends of the known world, and everywhere the image of the hero who united earth and sky was venerated. But beyond the temples and sacrifices, it was in the sky itself that his memory was immortalized. Zeus, so that men would forever remember his son, placed his image among the constellations. Thus, shepherds, raising their eyes at night, could discern the silhouette of Heracles, club raised, still defying the monsters of the heavens. The stars told his story. Their radiant glow recalled the flame of the pyre, and the celestial vault he had borne now rested on the shoulders of his memory. Every night, mortals could gaze upon the hero-turned star, and each generation passed his tale to the next. For the Greeks, Heracles was not merely brute strength, he was the very image of the human condition, born of the union of gods and men, subject to suffering and fault, yet capable of transcendence, redemption, and glory. His story showed that no one could escape fate, but that greatness was born from accepting the trial. His 12 labors, his later battles, his descent to the underworld, and his divine ascension were so many symbols. They reminded us that life is a series of obstacles, sometimes insurmountable, and that it is by facing them, even at the cost of pain, that man approaches the gods. Thus, the epic of Heracles ended in eternal light. But for men, it never ceased to be reborn. In the songs of poets, in the frescoes of temples, in fireside tales, his name resounded still, soothing fears, inspiring courage. For Heracles was no longer merely a hero of the past. He had become an invisible companion of the living, a guide in the darkness, a model of strength and resilience. And whenever the Greeks raised their eyes to the starry sky, they knew their hero watched over them among the gods and the stars. Thus concludes the destiny of the greatest of Zeus's sons. Heracles, who began his life in tears and Hera's hatred, ended it in eternal glory. Heracles, who killed through madness, purified himself through trial, and rose through pain. Heracles, who vanquished the monsters of earth and the underworld, became himself a star in the heavens. And for centuries upon centuries, his name endures, the hero, the immortal, the star. Thus ends the story of Heracles, the greatest hero Greece ever bore. His life, begun under Hera's jealousy, was a painful march between glory and suffering. He was a prodigious child who strangled the goddess's serpents, a husband broken by madness, a servant humiliated by a weak king, but also a warrior who felled monsters, a liberator of peoples, a traveler to the ends of the world. His 12 labors, accomplished through sweat and blood, were not merely physical feats. They were the very image of the human soul, called to struggle relentlessly against its own darkness. Each victory was a purification, each humiliation a step closer to the light. And yet, despite his unequaled strength, he could not escape the snares of fate. Neither monsters, nor gods, nor the underworld could defeat him, but a ruse, a poisoned potion, accomplished what Hera's hatred had always desired. Heracles, consumed by the fire of Mount Ota, chose his own departure, transforming his end into an act of grandeur and freedom. But death was not his tomb. The flames burned only his mortal shell. His divine essence was welcomed on Olympus. Reconciled with Hera, wed to the goddess Hebe, Heracles found at last the peace among the immortals. For men, he became more than a memory. He became a guide, a model, a star. His exploits were etched in songs, his images in temples, his name in hearts. In every battle, every trial of life, the Greeks saw in him the reflection of their own struggle, the inevitable pain, but also the possibility of rising, purifying, becoming greater than oneself. Even today, when one raises their eyes to the starry heavens, one can imagine his silhouette, club raised, walking among the constellations. Heracles no longer belongs to past centuries. He belongs to eternity. And in the silence of the nights, when the winds whisper at the summit of the mountains, perhaps one can still hear his breath, that of the hero who bore on his shoulders not only the sky, but the entire weight of humanity. Thank you for joining me tonight on this journey through history. I hope this tale has brought you peace and wonder. Don't forget to subscribe to Twilight Tales for more stories to guide you into a serene sleep. Take care and see you soon.